All right. Yeah, it is. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dr. José Angel Araguz. And yeah, this is going to be, I think officially this is supposed to be like a faculty lecture. And it's going to be, but I always feel like the word lecture, like it feels like somebody's in trouble. No one's in trouble here, all right? What I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be sharing a little bit of about my new book that's forthcoming in March of 22. It's coming up. I'm going to read through some of the key poems and tell stories. I usually like to give anecdotes and such at my poetry readings. So I'm going to lean into that, and that'll be kind of the lecture portion. So I'll tell you a little bit about the poems and that are kind of key to this manuscript. And then at the end of the reading, I will give you an opportunity for Q&A, because I know people have questions about the publishing industry and everything, and I'm happy to share that as well. But yeah, see, I drew my name. Of course, I've got a lesson plan, right? Because this is, you're not going to be lessoned at, but I am. I try to keep organized. The main thing, as I'm going to be talking about my new book, Rotura, and hold on, let me share my screen so I can show you the cover. This is going to be briefly. So this is the cover. Heather Goodwin is the artist who did the artwork here, and the good people at Black Lawrence Press were kind enough to give me different options, and I went with this one specifically because of the title. I'm like, it's a word in Spanish, rotura, which means rot, and I feel like this helps. The visual here helps with anybody who's Spanish impaired. You've got the word rot highlighted through this dichotomy here. So, and yeah, this one really spoke to me. So that is the cover. And so yeah, for my writers in the audience, y'all know that, or anybody who's had to work on a book, books take a long time. And so the first poem that was written for this manuscript specifically came around in 2016, right after the presidential election of Donald Trump. I was invited by a poet named J.M. Miller. They reached out on behalf of terrain.org. They were doing a series of letters to America at that time. Terrain.org, if you're not familiar with them, they're a cool online journal. And they were doing a series of essays, fiction, and poetry all about the election, the things that were bubbling up at the time, and that boiled over, right? And so I was like, well, how do I write a letter to America? What does this mean? And I was really caught by the phrase, the way you start off a letter, right? Dear America. And so there's also these books, if for kids, it's like these journals of kids from different time periods, like Dear America, and then you get to find out all this historical information about the Titanic or colonial times. And so I was like, okay, let me start there. So I'm going to read the poem, American Studies, and I will. That first kind of came out of this, and it's dated. It's one of the few poems that I date where I'm like, okay, November 22nd, 2016. That's when I wrote it, and that's when I finalized it. I'm like, I'm not touching it. And you know how tough that is if you're a writer, not to go back and revise. All right, so this poem is in 3 parts. This poem is called American Studies. My wife tells me of reading the Dear America books as a child, those stories told via the diaries of young women who lived during difficult times in American history. In these stories filled with suffering were the facts behind the suffering. Her favorite involved the RMS Titanic, the unsinkable ship that sank. I ask if trying to imagine what it looked like was what captivated, and she says no. Says only one book led to another, until she realized she could never see it nor accept it. After the election, my friend explains he feels he could manage here, but not his children. He explains he spoke to their school director, who comforted by talking about police presence. But if there's police, he asks, before anything happens, what will happen when something does? American algebra. Everything is X until proven Y. Dear America, if X represents what my friend feels thinking about the police, what language do you imagine he worries his children speaking publicly? And what language are we speaking now? Show your work. Another friend writes to me, here's a verse I think about a lot. And maybe the mirror of the world will clear once again. She shares she's been sick since the election, as I have been. I imagine our voices trying to commiserate between coughs. In physics, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. What American physics happens here as I read and hear her voice behind the verse she sent? Are you, dear America, afraid as I am that our faces will no longer be there when the mirror clears? But yeah, that was it was such a weird time. I mean, even that feels like a euphemism, right? That feels like it was so charged, right? And so that's kind of where this book kind of started, Rotura. It started with this like, well, how do we, everything's always changing. How do we say something to the moment? Especially like as a marginalized writer, it's a whole lot of, well, yeah, why do you have to bring us down? Why do you have to be political? And I'm like, we gotta speak to the moment. And in my 20 plus years of writing, I've slowly made peace and have learned how to like be present in that kind of assertion, in that conviction that like, well, everything's political. Like I can't believe in anything universal, and I can't not talk about what's happening in the world. The next two poems I'm gonna read are poems that bookend the manuscript. So the first poem, A Question Before the Election, is the first poem in the manuscript. And then the poem that I'll read following that one, Questions After the Election, is the poem at the end of the book. And I feel they encapsulate both what was going on at that time for me emotionally, but also even though they start and end the book, the whole book isn't about like politics. It's not like rant after rant about Trump. I mean, the late night talk show hosts did that for us. The poets don't have to do that. But yeah, I kind of want to share them because of the different play on things. So anyway, this is called A Question Before the Election. My mother asks if I've heard of the KKK. A month later, the election will turn in favor of a man endorsed by them. A month later, my wife and I will begin unpacking how we represent what is not wanted here. Give us not your disabled nor woman, not brown skin of self and family and families. A month later, we will grow quiet, swiping at our screens to refresh reality, hoping the next flash of text and pixels will give us reason to speak above a mumbled grit-lined whisper, to move the air beyond the pause of remembering to breathe. Because she has heard of a man who brings the worst out of people. Because she wants to warn me, but is years late, to shield me from history, from thefts and sideways glances, outright glares, from nights of glass bottles broken behind me, thrown from cars crammed with frat boys yelling, "Go back to your country." My mother asks if I've heard of the KKK. A year later, I will be thinking of lists in poems. What it is one inventories, makes space for, stops to see in lists. A year later, I would list different things my mother and I are years late for. Like me asking what it was like for her when she first came to this country, or her asking me why I write, why I teach, why I do anything but hide and stay quiet, like she asked me to as a child. A year later, I will have been walking, looking over my shoulder for more than 30 years. The man I am, looking over my shoulder, not noticing that I march behind the youth I was, who starved himself and hoped to disappear. Too busy looking over his shoulder to know he marched behind the teen I was, in black t-shirts, who kept checking and correcting his English and hating his skin, too in his head and looking over his shoulder, to know he marched behind the child I was, alone in garage apartments, staring out the windows at trees and cars, ducking down when a cop car passed and closing his eyes. A year later, it will hit me that these years of looking over my shoulder are a list inside me that inventory makes space for, stop to see the fear inside me. My mother asks if I've heard of the KKK, and I feel the worst has found its way into my palm. The worst has me clutching it, hearing it sounded out in my mother's voice. And I know then what I hold in my hands will continue to grow heavy. What I hold in my hand trembles. When I cry, my wife cries. Friends tell me they cried. When I remember in a hushed, hurried voice, as if we were calling to each other from different parts of a dark wood, wanting to both call out and be found, but also not draw attention, my mother asking me, ¿Has oído del KKK? I feel failure, desengaño, loss, deception, breakdown, caída, defeat, quebrado, collapse, rotura, frustration, amargura, grief. Bueno, pues, sí. Questions after the election. In her story about being told by her white bosses, white secretaries, vote Trump, you better vote Trump, as she punched out from work as usual, tired and body sore. Does my mother know she gathered the darkness of each corner of the factory and the darkness of the drive home, switching between stations, nothing sounding right, and the darkness in her mind, listing all the work waiting for her at home, and the darkness of the night over Corpus Christi, how these darknesses spill over now into every word I am urged to write. Because nights like these are ink, and her story of pretending not to hear, but telling me what she heard, what was said, is a story of darknesses being separated, made distinct as words on a page, which hold darkness in one form until we close our eyes and darkness shifts to darkness shifted. At the end of her shift, does she know about the darkness I will hold for her? So I always feel bad because my poems are heavy, which is why I try to smile in my author photos. But even this book is not going to have an author photo that where I'm smiling, because I feel like, well, it's called Rotuta. It's called rot. Why smile? But what's it called? As you can see, the list idea starts in the beginning of the book, is picked up at the end, and I kind of engage with it here and there throughout the collection. Let's see. I want to move to a poem. I feel like one of the things that holds this collection of poetry together is these longer pieces, these longer poems. And one of the things that happened shortly after the election was, you heard me say the phrase Corpus Christi in the last poem, and that's my hometown, Corpus Christi, Texas. My family came from Matamoros, Mexico, and mom crossed the river to give us a better life, and she did it. She was like 14 when she did it, and but I grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas, and yeah, there was a water crisis, and so I had this poem from like my grad school days. Like, I'm talking, this next poem I'm going to read, is the first draft of it came like in 2005, 2006, not to date myself. And I had all these poems about like, I'm going to write about the two rivers around my hometown, the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, the Nuts River. Nueces just means nuts. And which is suiting, right, for my hometown. No, don't laugh at that. There's good people in my hometown. But I wanted to go epic. I wrote this really long first draft about two rivers and the history between the United States and Mexico and the border culture. And it didn't really come together. And it wasn't until I was working on this manuscript that I decided, like, okay, what are the things that this book is kind of dealing with? It's dealing with politics. It's dealing with divided identity. And also how we seek out our identity. How do we engage with history? Like, what do we need? Oh, Gente's here. Corpus, Third Coast. Cool. Thank you. What's it called? How do we get to who we are? And so this poem is in 4 pieces, and it's called Four Dirges. And it didn't come together for me until I started revising with an eye towards T.S. Eliot, of all people. I ended up I have, if you've ever taken a class with me or talked poetry with me long enough, you know that I take shots at T.S. Eliot all the time, like throw shade, for real. There's anti-Semitism, there's classism, there's racism involved, but he's one of the big dogs in American literature, so I can't like pretend that he doesn't matter. And so this kind of reckoning with history is what I wanted to tap into, both in this poem and in this manuscript. So one of the new things, this is the file this under talking about publishing. One of the new things I had to do for this book is ask for permissions to include quotes from different manuscripts. So, and pay for permissions. So, yeah, some of these quotes that you see in the book are I paid for those. So it's very interesting. But anyway, I think I'm trying to do the thing where I don't tell you about the poem, because I don't want to do the thing where a poet like tells you a story that's even better than the poem. I'm like, I'm not going to do that to you. But anyway, this poem is in 4 parts, and I called it Four Dirges. T.S. Eliot has a poem called The Dry Salvage, or not, I'm sorry, the Four Quartets is the name of a book. And so that's in 4 parts. So this is kind of like in conversation with him. And you'll hear me call him a couple of different names. They're all polite, don't worry. All right, so there's an epigraph here. This is 2 lines from a T.S. Eliot poem called The Dry Salvages. His poem starts off, I don't know about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. So just that, he's writing about the Ohio River. He calls it a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable. And I read that in my early 20s, and I had some feelings. And finally, I got it down. This poem is called Four Dirges. 1, Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, dirge. Thomas, it's true. You don't know about gods beaten and worn like the space left between paired jigsaw puzzle pieces, where a child has tried to force the wrong piece in. You might have known about gods who linger, who know lightning bolts, who know bargains and carry swords. But I think you lack the capacity to notice their lack of capacity to harbor and be a hand to shade our eyes. Shaded now, you don't know, and died not knowing the slosh of gods and the dark gleam of gods that reflect clean off badges, hot, overpaid hearts. This river god who rears and waits in place like a door left ajar, God that moves and darkens, this is not a being of your thoughts. 2, water dirge. Tom, do you not know that before boundaries were decided between men separating Mexico and the United States, there was water? Before the city lights made us forget the stars, and before the desert was made a road, and before people crammed into trucks and were called cargo, called nothing back there, officer, there was water. Do you think water is an argument waged between 2 gods? Think, where I believe water is blood split between 2 gods. Do you think, as I do, that I meant spilt and not split? Do you know much about the silence, so much like a river, when I've been seen as sullen, untamed, and intractable? 3, Nueces River dirge. Tommy, is your strong brown God also this chosen river, split from brother by distance and legislation, river that empties into Corpus Christi Bay? No, I know you spoke of the Ohio, And I know that river too. But what would you call the hard waters of my home city? What blessings for us who offer up nothing but faces can you think of? What looks back when we hold water in our hands and wait a moment of dark mirror? That we are then made in the image of what we cannot utter, that we are lost in clouded lifelines as we stand outside a door we have had no hand in making. For Corpus Dirge, December 2016. T. When the water was contaminated in Corpus, I did not consider gods, did not know them or think them able to help my family who already had bottled water in bulk. My mother who made sure her sons didn't drink from the tap, who attempted to shower with bottled water a few times, only to have to give up, her arms giving out after double shifts of work. When the water was tainted, I took the time to look up maps, traced by zip code the neighborhoods cut off from water, noted that where they lived, my family would live without service for some time. Same for the neighborhoods we used to live in, from Leopard to Greenwood, and yet water had been restored to areas I never saw until I had started driving and would detour through ritzy residentials, or so they seemed to me at 16. When it was tainted, I knew water had given off light like roads made of glass before I was born, knew that water bore and took in all that fell long before I'd fallen off the map I traced over trying to think and find any thin reassurance. When the water was tainted, it remained water and would remain water. And all the words wearing down in meaning are my family history, are part of my story. Mr. Eliot, before I was born, you wrote about a strong brown God. But what are gods when there is water in rivers who have nothing to do with what isn't already a part of them? If the river is within us, then why did I fear it killing those I cared for? Why do gods, beyond belief, knowledge, and thought, scrawl out of me, awkward, reverent, and dying? And in case you didn't pick up on the context clues, the dirge bit, I call those dirges. There's a couple of other dirges in there. Dirges are like funeral songs, and so I keep wondering when I'm not going to write a book about death, but here we are. I like my latest book, An Empty Pot's Darkness, literally has like an urn, a cremation urn on the cover. So, and who knew? Talking about T.S. Eliot, right? I'd say so. I got a couple more stories before I read the last poem. One thing that I was excited about with this book is that I have a couple sequences in it, a kind of longer poems. And I remember doing a reading when my first chapbook came out in 2012. For those of you, oh, thank you, Dana. I see all the love in there. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it. Gente, stop. What's it called? Yeah, so those of you who don't know, a chapbook is just a small book, somewhere between 15 to 30 pages of poetry. And they differentiate that in America from a full-length collection. You hear me use the word collection a lot. A full-length collection will be about 50 pages to 100 pages. And I share that because of just kind of like what it means to navigate the publishing world as a marginalized writer. Like you have to learn these terms. And I have a friend, Manuel Robles Montes, who's a novelist from Zacatecas, Mexico. He's teaching out in Ohio, I believe. Yeah. He's like, but Jose, like, why do you make such a difference between books? Like, a book is a book. And I'm like, you know what? You're not wrong. But that's how we do it here. And, you know, so much of moving forward is learning the rules. But I want to share a couple of stories about this book that's coming out. Specifically, this book used to be titled not Rotura. It used to be called We Say Yes Way Before You. And it's a line that former title is a line from a poem by Juan Felipe Herrera, wonderful poet, was a US Poet Laureate a couple years back. and just one of the great elders in Latinx literature. And I asked him for a blurb. But for this book, I was just like, well, it's a dark book. Who can I ask? And he was among the people I asked. And he did me the kindness. Like, he didn't have to, but he did me the kindness. If like asking for blurbs is like one of the worst things for a writer, because like we have to like it's like asking for a famous person's autograph, but like also giving them homework. You know, it's not as simple as an autograph. It's like, wait, you want me to read your book and think of something to say about it? So like, yeah, I gave former poet laureate Juan Felipe a homework. But anyway, he was very kind, and he did write me a blurb for this book, and I'll read you the blurb in a moment. But the other thing is that when he gave me the blurb, he also said, and I've got it here in my paper, I'm like, I suggest a new title. Thank you for the quote. I appreciate you wanting to include my work, but I think, what is it? I think this one is at the heart of your new collection. And he said Rotura. And that, you know, I thought to myself, I'm like, you know, he's a former US poet laureate. Like, I'm not gonna second guess him. Like, if he says, you know, this is your title, I'm like, okay, well, all right, I'll follow. And honestly, I asked a couple people, and he was the one writer who got back to me to do this blurb. And I mean, even one is a gift. I'm happy to have it. But there were a couple other writers, and another one in particular, I won't name him because I don't want to stir up drama in the Latino poetry world, but I'm glad he didn't get back to me ultimately, because what if, because the person I'm thinking of is another older Latinx poet, and he's also got a reputation for being cranky, and I would have hated for him to tell me, no, this is the title of your book now, and I'd be like, really? Like, which elder poet do I listen to, right? So this kind of stuff happens. I think one of the things I want to make sure that comes across, because I get asked a lot of questions, both from my students as well as the writers I mentor and build with in my communities, in my writing communities, about the publishing world and all that. And I share this story. This is not a flex. I'm not like, hey, I know Juan Felipe. I'm like, I don't know. He's a cool guy. I've hung out with him a couple times, like via workshops and all that. But I don't take it for granted that he wrote me a blurb. But I share it with y'all to show how much community is involved, how much human interaction is involved. Because if there's anything to counter the rotting that is in the title of my book, it would be human, like, hope, human engagement, human decency. Again, is it too naive of me to say human decency? Anyway, so I share the Juan Felipe story, and I should share the blurb. Okay, but in his blurb he says, and bless him, a moving book where the voice undulates dark and soul-filled along cracked borders, rising boundaries and worn brown gods along the routes, grasping at fading shimmers of truth, family, longings, and stark existence. Direct and tender, knowing and lifting, shifting and wandering. In all this rotura, rupture, there is warmth, love, suffering, and purpose for the long haul instead. A magnificent, profound, and necessary text from the Latinx Renaissance. Oh my God, I biffed that because I'm getting self-conscious. I'm like, I don't know about all that. You're hyping me up too much, dude. Don't tell him I said that, don't. No, but seriously, like, I love that he said this, and then he was like, yeah, Rotura, that's your, right? I'm with you. I'm like, so my book has been, since I got that blurb, it's gone through 50 revisions. No, I'm just playing, because I gotta live up to that blurb, right? But yeah, I want to talk about this final poem, because I could just go on, and my students will tell you, like, you can go on and on. But like, I want to close with one of the poems the last poem that I wrote for this manuscript. And it's called Certain Rivers. And as the manuscript was coming together, like I said, I've got the bookend poems, the question before the election, questions after the election. And again, the whole book isn't this, again, I feel like if I wanted to write a book, because as soon as Trump got elected, like, every poet, you know, I'm not just, you know, being snarky, like, we needed to express our anger, our frustration, our despair, our hurt, our betrayal. You see, the listing just happens. We needed to express those things, but also it came to a point where like everybody was writing about the same subject. And so it's like, okay, we all get it. I can't laugh at the Cheeto man jokes about Trump. I just can't, don't have that privilege. And as I wrote this, like I've sent it off to like at least 10 to 12 places across the years. And I really felt like, well, this is a dated book. Each year that passed since those first early poems, I was like, there's no way this is going to get picked up because it's from a different time period. But what I realized is that what I have is a snapshot of some of the rotting that was going on in my life and that I saw in society and in the world. That's really what the book's about. Rotting is timeless, right? Both Charles Baudelaire would agree, right? Such a poet. Rotting is forever. That's what we got in taxes, in student loan debt, right? Nah, I don't want to go off. That was too real for some of y'all. I'm sorry. But I still got student loan debt, so I know it's real. But as I was working on this book, I felt like there was a part missing, and that's where this last poem comes into play. I think so many poems about, I have so many poems about my phone conversations with my mom, and it's because part of my path has been to just move away from family. Like education has needed it. Like Corpus Christi didn't have the schools I needed to pursue the kind of paths I wanted to follow. And then by the time you start hopping between different teaching jobs, you just kind of follow the hustle. So yeah, there's a lot of physical distance between me and my family. And yeah, it seems like I'm always talking to my mom on the phone. I'm not. I don't get to talk to her as much as I would like. But and again, I'm avoiding telling you about the poem because the poem is the poem. I'm not speaking for the poem. I'll say one more thing about it. I shared that it was the last poem that I wrote for the manuscript, but also this poem, I realize now, as soon as I wrote it, I had an event, and it was the last live event that I did before COVID shut everything down. So like February of 2020, I did a reading with Ariana Rains here in Cambridge, close by, and yeah, it was the first time that I read this poem aloud, and hearing the crowd reaction made me feel like I was onto something. So, and now we are here. So you're the second folks to see this, or to hear this, I should say. There's an epigraph for this one too. Another thing that I paid for. Just take my money. Why don't you? Like, it's not. I mean, I'm quoting dead people a lot of the time, so they're not getting my money. But anyway. Any publishers in the audience, please don't tell people that I'm a terrible editor or got terrible ideas of writing. Anyway. All right, so the epigraph is from a Polish poet named Czesław Miłosz. And in a cool poem, he says, "When it hurts, we return to the banks of certain rivers." And I feel like rivers are a big thing, not just in my poetry, but like Latinx poets in general. Like we're always engaging with the rivers we cross or the oceans we cross even. Thinking of my South American familia. But last poem I'll read for you, and then I'll take a Q&A. This is called Certain Rivers. When a river is crossed, how many families hold their breath? Breath-made rivers they cannot keep inside, one after another, the only thought, adelante. Later, with children, with hours of work wearing down the body, these breath-made rivers run through dreams and stories. They tell their children not to voice. Small faces hold still while questions begin to course and shadows dam the back of the throat. I have made a myth of our river. In telling the myth, one river becomes many rivers. The one my mother crossed, lost in the one I cross now in ink. You can't step into the same river twice, but you can try. The sound will grow, will lap and splash. Sound of displacement, sound of will, of wanting. In your mind, sound of steps going nowhere. Water knows how to be lost, has a need for it. Just watch. The rain is all scramble and clearing of tracks. Watch a napkin over a puddle, how water goes for broke to be lost, clings, rises, soaks the fabric, pretending part like it does in clouds that grow, give, and clear. Shadow is a kind of water in that it knows one way to be lost. Just wait, shadow says, just wait. Water knows its way to truth. You can see what lies at the bottom of rivers. You can wash away the dirt to see your hands again. Water is, then, not the truth, but a way to it. Shadow, then, is not a lie, but something also passing over truth. Down the street at noon, you cannot look around without seeing others making the same strained face. A country also knows its way to truth, but can choose to pass over it. In this country of water and shadow, truth is strained from our faces. My mother turns to water on the phone. The river of her voice carries the years between us, years where I have strained to catch something of our changing faces. The river of her voice is a kind of truth I know. I see what lies at the bottom of these years. I wash away the dirt and see my hands tremble. Water knows how to be lost, has a need for it, but it cannot choose. A river runs to ocean and is not lost, just ocean. A river runs dry and is lost, you think, but later it returns, and only then do you ask, what is a river? But never answer, happy to have the river. People know how to be lost to others. Crossing rivers helps. People know, but they must choose, and even then they are not lost to themselves. Mother, you brought me with you over water, over a way to truth, over the distance of your shadow, and in shadows now we wait for the other to call. Sometimes she calls in tears, and like an earthworm when the rain comes and fills its burrow, a part of me works itself out to the surface to breathe. I can hear the water in her words, flooding sentences of love and regret, cloud what I know how to say. Whatever actual clouds in the distance between her and I, rearrange as she continues to break and give herself over to the 10 or 15 minutes it takes to grieve that one cannot grieve. No hay tiempo, tus hermanos, esta casa nunca está limpia, ¿no ves? Cuida bien esa niña tuya, lo siento, no hablamos suficiente, deberíamos, gente muere, ¿sabes? I know this voice from other nights, other cold moments when I've stopped in my life to listen, drummed out from the dirt of where I live and made to gleam like rain and worms, glass bottle shards. The hard face of a television clicked off to leave a house quiet, but for the pleading half whisper, half snore of a woman with no time to grieve. Thank you. That is the last poem I'll read. I'm catching my breath. But I should probably translate a little bit. There's a little bit here. And this is actually my first event for this book. So like, thank you all for being here for this. But I want to like translate the Spanish there because you got that little bit. There's my mom's voice comes in. And the Spanish is, no hay tiempo, tus hermanos, esta casa nunca está limpia, ¿no ves? Cuida bien esa niña tuya, lo siento, no hablamos suficiente, deberíamos, gente muere, ¿sabes? And yeah, pulled from a conversation my mom and I had, and it translates to, it follows the line, to grieve that one cannot grieve. There's no time. Your brothers, this house is never clean. You see, take care of your wife. I'm sorry, we do not speak enough. We should. People die, you know. It's just like my mom is the poet, really. So, but I want to make sure to share that because that's crucial. And I try to be slick sometimes, depending on where I'm reading, to like translate as I go. But I'm like, nah, that big chunk needs to just be there. Oh, thank you, Andita. I appreciate that. Oh, thank you, Lau. So, hope lives in community. Oh, I love that. That's awesome. Thank you. That's okay. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I'd like to go ahead. I think I've shared the poems I had planned. I'm curious if folks have questions. I'm happy to take some questions now, either about publishing, about making the book, or just, I don't know. I know a lot about guitar and spirits, so you can ask me about both. Oh, thank you, Lauren. There's a link to my blog there, The Friday Influence, and also a link to pre-order the book. But, you know, yes, publishing choice with Black Lawrence. Ah, yeah, no, I've been sending to Black Lawrence for a while. Thank you, Chente. I've been sending to Black Lawrence Press for a while. I've always liked their work, and I've known people working there. Like, one of the things they don't tell you right away with publishing is that there's human beings who work at these places, and they're readers just like you and me. And so when I give advice to young writers about publishing, or just writers in general about publishing, I'm like, you're gonna psych yourself out because you don't know you have to learn the terms of publishing and how they want their files and this and the other. But you learn those, but just remember too that you send your work out so that it can find readers. If you get rejected, those aren't your readers. So just send to another place, you'll find them. And yeah, Black Lawrence was I sent them a majority of, this is another thing I wonder too, like, I wonder how many editors out there read and remember things they rejected, because they've seen a lot of my manuscripts and they like this one. So I really appreciate it. Diane, this is the first time you hear about this a lot in publishing, where people are like, oh, when I got the call. And I think that's a lot of fiction writers, because fiction writers get the, that big book advance, and poets, we don't get agents, we don't get, auctioned off or anything. Our books don't get auctioned, set up for auction or anything. We send, we hear back, and then we go from there. But Black Lawrence is the first time. Dan Guttle is the first editor to call me. And I was in the middle of a move, so like life was chaotic last May. But she called me and she was like, hey, just finished your manuscript. I love it. I want to give it home. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, well, one, you're putting me on the spot. Do you know, like, I'm in the middle of X, Y, and Z. I'm packing boxes. But no, I wasn't cranky. I was very grateful and very happy. So, but yeah, it was out at a couple different places. And yeah, like I said, I admire them, and so they picked it up during an open period. An open reading period just means that it's not a competition. Usually books will get published through a poetry book specifically will get published through competitions or things like that. But there was also something called an open reading period, which I personally like to submit to more than competitions, because one, competitions cost a lot of money. Open reading periods will cost money too. But I do like the idea of somebody choosing you because they like you, not because it's the best book out of all of the, like that competition. I don't know. So I hope that answers your question there, Cynthia. Dana, hey Dana, thank you for being here. Can you describe how you go about putting a book together? Is there a moment when you know you have the poems that can make the book? It all depends. It's been different each time. But one thing for sure is that if I find myself thinking in terms of like, oh, okay, this poem isn't enough, I need to write another poem to go alongside it, or and actually the submitting to magazines helps in that too, because for those of you who aren't familiar, when you submit poems to magazines, you have to send them in batches of 3 or 5 poems. So already that practice gets you thinking in terms of like, oh, what poems live together? What's going on here? So with this book in particular, oh God, before it was called what it used to be called. It used to be called, I'm gonna type this in the chat for posterity, so that if people, one, it's tough to say, and two, I wanna see, I think it's 023. Now I can't use this anymore, but when people ask me how to do the accent on my name, I say, oh, if you're on a Mac, if you're on a what is PC, it's alt 0233. So it used to be called that, but back then the batches of poems that I came together were very, I don't know, they were kind of they had the 2 bookend poems. I know for sure I wanted those 2 poems to begin and end the manuscript, but what the first early drafts of the manuscript were very much like lacking the coherence. Like I didn't know how to look. I only say this now, but looking back, they didn't commit to anything. And I think this is a good time to share too, Dana, to your question of like, so much of how do books come together? So much of it is balancing intention with intuition. I feel like there's all these guidelines and advice that I can give, but really it comes down to taking the time to sit there with your work and really like, okay, what are the threads here? What are the things that are coming together? One slick quote that I like to bring up sometimes is by Robert Frost. He says that if a book of poems has 25 poems, the book as a whole should be the 26th poem. And I'm like, well, one, that's slick. I have my issues with Frost as well, but the whole canon, just bring it. You know, Robert Frost and T.S. Eliot, they'll be fine if I talk smack. You know, they're solidified in history. But yeah, I like that Robert Frost quote because I'm like, yeah, it is. That's kind of what I mean by intuition. Like you can intend and walk toward what you think a manuscript is doing, but you do have to take a beat and step back and into it. Like, is this where this pack of poems wants to go, or am I forcing it? Do I need to like? Is there another direction to go? And as I shared, like even down to the title, down to like when the manuscript was accepted for publication. Bless Juan Felipe Herrera, but he knew like, hey, that's not your title. Like, and which again, I was trying to title it a line from one of his poems. So there's both humility in the fact that he's like, no, here's your title. But it's also like, you're telling me my title? Yeah. But like I said, when I sat with it, I'm like, yeah, Rotuta. I feel like that. One thing too I'll share about this is there was I think my second book, I wanted to call it A Word in Spanish, and I got talked out of it by somebody because they were like, oh, if it's a title in Spanish, it won't get published. People won't know what to do with that. So I'm just like, man. And it came out with a good title, but I felt like this was an opportunity to return and, you know, have some space for a Spanish word title. So that really meant a lot to me. All right. Ana says, Maria Simone says, Ana says, wants to know if the recording of tonight's reading will be sent to our email. No, I don't think so, but I believe I'm going to be able to post it on my YouTube channel and on my blog. So I'll give you a heads up, Ana and Maria Simone. The Sarmiento household will know about it, all right? That's what's up. Let's see. Oh, Allie, you made it. Thank you so much. How do you decide when a poem is finished? When it's published. If not, the poem's gonna keep bugging you. The poem's gonna keep bugging you. Like the longer it stays unpublished, you're gonna keep coming back to it. Be like, okay, it's time to submit to magazines. Right, I got to do something with you. But what if I do this? What if I change that? You know, depending on what kind of writer you are, like you will always want to tinker. And I leave poems alone when they're published in a book, because even when they're published in a magazine, depending if I'm working, like the example I like to give is sometimes I do books that are just in prose poems, so just like prose blocks. And I've taken poems that get published in magazines in lines, and I'm like, you know what, the theme or the vibe of this poem sits with the narratives in this collection. Let me move it over and change the form so that it fits with this and the other. It's that kind of intuition. That's what I mean, that kind of practice. But ultimately, because I want to make sure I give you a legit answer. One, because I respect you, Ellie, and two, it's because as much as I talk up here, I don't want to get lost up here. Like I want to make sure my writers have legit tools. You just gotta trust your gut and try it out on some people. Either read it at an open mic or read it at a reading, because that'll tell you right quick. As soon as other people are hearing and you're aware of it, you're like, oh, I got to change that line. I didn't like how that sounded. Or like maybe somebody later will be like, oh yeah, I thought you were going to go in this direction. And I'll be like, this isn't done. I just wrote it. And you can start qualifying, right? But really, you just gotta. What's the advice to give? Trust yourself to have written the most complete poem you have at that moment in time. because again, like my revision process takes me so long. Like I will write in notebooks and leave them alone for about a year or two. And then when I come back to the poem, I'll have forgotten it or whatever. And sometimes even when I draft a poem on my computer, I'll still leave it alone because I'm like, I'm still not happy with it. And I can't tell you, like, the way the phrase "I'm still not happy with it" implies that I'm happy with my poem. I'm not. But there does come a point where you're just like, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. And so when you have that nerve where you feel like, okay, I'm excited about this, I feel like it's done, and you have the nerve enough to send it out for publication or to share it with someone, that's one of the tells that like, okay, this could be on its way to be done, you know? So yeah, share. Sadly, we have to stop being hermits. I hate that. I would much rather be a hermit. Let's see. Brian Tripold asks, "Sir, thank you for coming. The cover of the edition, if I remember correctly, has a candle, yeah. And in the blurb, the word lifting was used. Do any of the poems in the collection convey a sense of hope? If so, how?" No, no hope. There's no hope. There's no, just playing. No, there is some hope. I hope, at least. There's a poem in the manuscript. Hold on, it's 3 lines. So I want to make sure to get it correct. What's it called? But it's hope as defined by where I grew up, I think, which is South Texas, which is right along the border. What's it called? So there's a writer named Norma Cantu, a great poet, great prose writer, and she talks about how those of us from South Texas, we've learned how to like grow up and like cry through our like laugh through our tears. And I feel like that's so spot on because like it took me a while of being away from Texas, like for college. The first time I was ever out of Texas, not just to go to Mexico, but to like another part of the US, was to go to college. And I would be sharing these stories that I didn't know were traumatic, that I didn't know not everybody got hit with a chancla or a belt or, you know, 8 Manny sandwiches when there's no food around, or even just when hungry. Right? I didn't know others didn't grow up like me. And when I was telling these stories and kind of laughing, like, oh yeah, and we ate mayonnaise sandwiches, and I'm kind of laughing, and people are like, "Are you okay? Who hurt you?" I'm like, poverty, systemic oppression. And so I'm going to share this quick poem. It's 3 lines, Brian. So it's Brian's fault you get an extra poem. But I think there's hope as defined by the kinds of struggles I grew up with. So this is called Roaches. Copper flecked, I reached for one as a child to see what luck I had. Which, I mean, you know, we grow up with all these ideals, and then there's the reality, right? And I feel like part of my message of hope is we got to keep working. We got to keep doing the work. I mean, the world felt like it ended for a lot of people in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, but it's still going. We're still here, and oh my God, we could not even imagine what, you know, 2021 was going to be like, much less 2020, you know, with the pandemic and everything. And I want to say, like, we just keep doing the work, we'll keep surviving. And I feel like survival isn't happiness. Survival just means we're here. And for me, that's where hope lives. Hope lives with survival, not happiness. So you got to come with the right H word. Like, it's a dark book for hope, for survival. My happy book will have, I don't know, I think you like unicorns. Somebody in the English department likes unicorns. I'll have unicorns on my cover at one point. Thank you, Brian. Okay, I got a couple more questions. Gente, what did you do this time around that you haven't done with your previous book? Is this your 6th? Oh, thank you. No, thank you for keeping count. This is the 5th one? Book number 5. Yeah, book number 5 on the way, I think is what I wanted to tweet, but I didn't have the nerve to tweet. I'm like, you're not a rapper about to drop a mixtape. But one of the things I've done differently, if y'all notice, hopefully in a good way, you notice that the poems were long. Hopefully your eyes can glaze over, and if they did, well, that's fine, I get it. It's a Saturday night. But I let myself write a long poem, and actually, I'm gonna share my screen so folks can see this. But one of the things I did, there's the Roaches poem that I told y'all about, is that first poem, A Question Before the Election. I let myself do things like this. More than one of the poems in the manuscript do this, where there's the title, and I'm going to scroll out, and you can see there's the title of the poem. There's one line, and then here's a stanza. And then the next page has another stanza, and then another stanza. So they're not individual poems. It was the first time, Chente, that this was, that I let myself take up this much space, which again is something, one of the ways I feel like writing and life kind of mirror each other, is that both as a marginalized person, as a human being, as somebody who struggles with depression, anxiety, and just, you know, like everyone, like work overload, right? Under a capitalist system, like I've slowly learned to take up presence, to have a presence, to have space, and to kind of, it's one of the reasons I love teaching. It's because it forces me to be there 100% present for my students. And it allows me to practice that. And so having a poem do that, having a poem take up 16 pages, one poem, and have lines of poetry just sink in. Like, here is one line of poetry. My mother asked if I've heard of the KKK. Just sit there, let that sink in, right? Like the meme. That's one of the new things that I've done here. I also have some fun pantoums in there for my poetry nerds, but you'll have to find those. Okay, I'm looking at the time, so I do want to wrap up, but I do want to make sure to add that. Oh, okay. Let's see. George has a question. Maybe ready to answer the unchat written questions. All right, let me get to these two, and then we'll end with George's question. So Maria Simone asks, how easy or difficult is it for you to use Spanish in your poetry? I mean, it's easy. It's tough to share it. I'll say that. It slowly over the years has gotten better to share it, to the point that, yeah, I'm publishing poems half in Spanish, more or less, with this book. And I feel like the easy part of my answer is that the words just come, right? Like when I'm writing about my family, I'm not gonna translate. I'm gonna write down the words they said. I'm not gonna translate them. And so I'm always been practicing, like putting that in print, putting that in published books. Because I mean, you always want the words to matter, and you want to represent yourself well and authentically. So my advice just in general of using Spanish in your poems is like, yeah, give it presence, let it have its space. Like, I've learned a lot through second guessing, but I'm here to tell you, don't second guess yourself. Your writing's important. People need your words. All my writers here, like, people need your words, so get them out there how they come. And if people, there's something, Benjamin Alidi Signs, a poet out of El Paso, he talks about being in workshop with Joseph Brodsky. Joseph Brodsky was a Russian poet who I think he became a U.S. citizen. I think he's Russian American, and Benjamin Alidi Signs was in a workshop with Joseph Brodsky, and Brodsky was like, "Why are you putting Spanish words in these poems? Like, why?" Like, he made him feel bad, which is an experience a lot of marginalized writers, Latinx writers will face. It's like, why are you putting Spanish words in your poems? And I'm like, you know what? And this is Signs' response too. It's like, if American literature in English is riddled with phrases in French, phrases in so many like Eurocentric accepted languages. And I'm like, you know what? And especially now, I tell my students, I'm like, you've got Google Translate in your pocket there. Just doesn't hurt you. Does not cost you anything to like Google Translate something. And Duolingo will help you out too. Like, that owl is on it. So like I said, it was difficult at the beginning to get it out there, to share it, but it's easier now these days. And that's a journey. I'm working on a book of poems right now, all in Spanish. And I'm still, I don't know, it's still in the what I'll call the putty stage, where I'm like, maybe it'll stretch out this way, maybe it'll stretch out that way. Okay, Lau, Lau, thank you for coming. Rotura, something that is torn, broken, cracked. I love the title. Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So going for the last question here from George. Go for it, sir.
Hey, Jose, it's not a question, more of a comment.
Oh, okay.
The book sounds beautiful, and I was jotting down lines like, "In this country of water and shadow, truth is drained from our faces." Beautiful line. And I just wanted to say, sort of this book in the context of your other books, that one thing I admire so much is your lyric dexterity, whether it's free verse or formal verse. I remember you read the Sestina, and I think we talked about that, or prose poems. I think you're always staying within your voice, sounding a convincing register. And that's true of these political poems, which I think for anyone who writes poetry knows how hard that is to do. But you don't contort your voice, you don't cut emotional corners. And to quote you one more time, you refresh reality. So wonderful reading. Book sounds beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. That means a lot. That means a lot. Oh, that means a lot, George, because you are yourself a wonderful poet, a great poet on the page, and especially when it comes to matter of form and craft, and that is something I work on. I appreciate it, and I guess I'll end with this kind of by sharing a couple of things about form, because I'm a geek about form. I tried. There was a year when I was doing my MFA at NYU, where I was writing like a sonnet a day, and they all came out so bad. I was reading. I read the greats. I read Milton the sonnets, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Robert Frost, Edna Simpson Millay. I read them all. I'm like, look at them. They're so slick in their sonnets. And I would write 14 lines a day, and I would try to rhyme, and my measure was all off. But then I learned that part of that, again, this is part of the mutating, the intention versus intuition, right? I intended to write sonnets, and I banged my head against the wall. And then my intuition slowly was like, well, I learned a lot how to read poems that are written in strict measures and strict forms. And it taught me how each poem kind of has to find its own form and measure. And I don't know, I feel like I play a lot of games with my writing. Like there's a couple of poems in here that are in syllabics, which is just a certain set of syllables per line. And you don't need to know that to appreciate the poem, but it's there. I often will count words per line. There's a whole long poem in this manuscript that has, I believe it's 8 or 9 words per line, except for the last 2 lines. And I forget what those numbers are. So little games like that. And if people notice it, that's fine. I said there was a pantoum in the book too. A pantoum is a form that includes repeating lines in a kind of distinct way. It's a Malaysian form. And, but again, with the idea of like intention versus, or the balance of intention versus intuition, every time a line repeats, I change it. Or when I'll repeat, this I do in the Sestina, George mentioned, thank you for mentioning that. I will sometimes, when it's time to repeat a word within a poetic form, I will sometimes repeat it in Spanish, or if I said it in Spanish first, I'll repeat it in English. And I feel like that's kind of the play that I enjoy. And I think I'll, 2 more things, and then I'll stop, I promise. One is that, I'll share the heavy thing first. One of the poems in this book does include a quote from a professor back when I was doing my PhD. And he actually said things similar to what you said, George. He says like, you've got, but he said them in really mean kind of toxic ways. So it means a lot to me that you just said what you said, George, because part of what he said was like, hey, you mistake music for wisdom, or you mistake wisdom for music. No, the other way. Music for wisdom. You've got a good ear, but it's melodramatic. An ear trained by white literature will think this just overblown. You might find an audience, you might not. And it's one of the heavier moments in the poem. And it's moments like that I've had with professors, and I've had professors or supposed mentors who just give bad advice or give advice that's kind of like, hey, you're not taking into consideration me being first gen, me being marginalized. Like, I don't have the resources you have. I don't have, that things are different for us. It's a moment in the book where I'm just like, but really, I work so hard at form, but you're not going to accept it. And the professor is white, and he is well versed himself in poetic forms and all this. And I'm like, hey, I want to contribute to that conversation, and it felt like a door slam. But I didn't let that door stay closed, because I'm going to write what I write. And if I said earlier, hey, publishing is about finding your readers, he's not my reader. maybe that's what I learned there. It's what kind of what I'm walking away with. So that was the heavy part. The last thing I'll share is, oh gosh, did I forget it? I probably forgot it. Oh well. Oh yeah, I'll share that there's a lot of, if not exactly hope, I like to think there's hope, kind of hard-won hope, and also a lot of just acknowledgement of where things are in the book. So I hope you don't just think it's a downer. But anyway, again, I want to thank all y'all for being here, for making time on a Saturday night for poetry, for my work. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. And yeah, please, if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at the Friday Influence. That's somewhere in the chat. And if you're a student at Suffolk, you can just email me. I'm happy to keep the conversation going. But again, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. And it's hard not to end this the way I end my classes. They're like, all right, if you have any questions, feel free to stay after class. If not, awesome. We're down. I forgot to, oh, thank you, Valerie. And I forgot to publicly thank everyone. Laura, thank you for all the hard work. Valerie, thank you for putting the word out. And thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Jose.
You are doing, of course. Have a good night. Take care. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Jose.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I'll send you the recording when I have it, probably Monday, just to.
Oh yeah, no, I've taken too much of your time. All right, go ahead. Fine, I'm gonna go ahead. I think actually, wait, are we recording? Stop the recording.